Welcome back. Let's talk about vector graphics. As I said before, there are two types of digital graphics. We talked about raster graphics last time. Now we'll talk about vector graphics. Vector graphics are made up of lines or paths. A good example of vector graphics is the connect the dots game that a child would play. They'll have a piece of paper with a series of dots, or in vector graphics, their coordinates, and they'll take their crayons, each a different color, and they'll trace those dots, and eventually, when they trace all of them, the object will be revealed. Quick summary. In vector graphics, you have sets of coordinates and lines connecting them. Or in plain language, you have dots and lines connecting the dots. Let's think about this. Every time you open a vector graphic on your computer, it basically draws it using that connect the dot methodology. If the computer is drawing that graphic every time it's opened, then that must mean you could ask the application to upscale that graphic 500%, 1000%, and the computer would just redraw it at that higher scale. Now remember, in raster images, the pixels are defined. If you remember, 1080p has over 2 million pixels. Most likely they'll be varying in color. So when the computer opens a raster image file, it's just displaying pixels. The computer says, look, you gave me all the information. Here's what you gave me. But in vector, the computer is given the structure of the image, and then it generates a graphic based on that structure. Then the computer says, oh, okay, you want me to draw that? Here you go. This is one of the main reasons vector graphics are so important. Now that we understand that, let's talk about where vector graphics are used. A good example would be billboards. Generally, billboards are very large, so you would need an extremely high resolution when you're printing your graphic. This is where the vector graphic comes in because you can output any resolution that you need. Another example is fonts. If you notice, when you make your font larger, it looks just as good as it did before you increase the size. A lot of companies create their logos in a vector format. And again, the reason is because vectors are so scalable. There are several vector file formats available, and we'll talk about a few of them. The first one I'll mention is the AI file format, and that is artwork for Adobe Illustrator. The second file format is a DXF file, and that is a CAD format from Autodesk. The third file format I'll mention is the EPS file format. It stands for Encapsulated PostScript. It might be the most common vector image format, and it's frequently used in the printing industry. The last file format I'll mention is the SVG format, and that stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. It's a standard file format from the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C. These days, many applications support SVG files. We've already talked about some of the pros. As I've said before, probably the biggest pro for vector graphics is the scalability. You can instruct the computer to redraw that graphic at any scale you need. Another pro is that these files can be smaller when compared to a raster file. It really depends on the complexity of the graphic, but in general, vectors will be smaller. Vectors aren't your run-of-the-mill graphic format, so a con would be compatibility. You probably won't be able to send your grandma a vector file without her having to download a special application to view it. One of the applications she might download is Inkscape, SVG Edit, or Vector. If you've ever used any photo editing software more complex than Microsoft Paint, then you'll know that there are a bunch of effects that they have. You can generate a drop shadow, all kinds of different blur effects. You can add noise to the picture. There are just so many filters and effects you can apply. In the world of vector graphics, though, this isn't the case. Creating effects like a drop shadow can become labor intensive. That's something to be aware of. Let me demonstrate how scalable vectors are. This is the same image I showed last time in a high resolution. If you recall, when I zoomed it in, it was a pixelated low-res mess. But now look, Taking advantage of the scalability that vectors offer, I can create that image in a high enough resolution so that when you zoom in, the quality of the picture still looks great. Just for comparison purposes, here is the low resolution version, and it looks just as bad as I remember it. And here is the high res version. Looks great. In summary, we defined vector-based graphics. Just remember, connect the dots. We went through use cases such as billboards, fonts, and logos, and we talked about formats like EPS and SVG. We also discussed the pros and cons. Again, the biggest pro is the scalability that vectors offer. And finally, we demonstrated that scalability. The next 2 lectures will be hands-on demonstrations. I'm going to show you what it looks like to actually manipulate vectors. If you're still not sure you completely understand vectors, these 2 lectures should turn your light bulb on. Thanks, we'll see you then.